Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, this is Book 4 of the Wolfman Chronicles, Chapter 14, A Bloody Good Wedding. This is taking place in Mexico and Alaska. The Legends of the Blood Wedding. The Blood Wedding is a tragedy written by the Spanish playwright and poet Federico Garcia Lorca and first performed in a theater in Madrid about 1933. And in the story, the beautiful young bride finds herself torn between two men, ultimately leading to disastrous consequences. The bride is engaged to the bridegroom, yet she's still in love with her former lover. Much like Romeo and Juliet, the families of the two lovers are at war with each other, and they are forbidden to be together. Though still desperately in love with each other, and both are forced to marry other people. Their combined choice to run away together after the marriages is one that ultimately culminates in their deaths. The two lovers hide in the forest. The moon appears and states that by the end of the night, blood will be spilt. Death, disguised as an old beggar woman, speaks of the finiteness of life and how the night will end in death. The bride appears, her dress covered in the blood of her lovers who killed each other in the forest. Garcia Lorca achieved international recognition and has been called one of the most important Spanish poets and playwrights of the 20th century. And he was assassinated by nationalist forces at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. His remains have never been found. Juanita loved drama. The more, the better. Theater had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. As a young girl, when her parents were still alive, she and her brother Miguel performed plays for their parents' entertainment. Juanita designed elaborate costumes, and the two kids would perform at their parents' many social events. In high school, Juanita had truly come into her own on the stage. Her crowning achievement was playing the lead role of the bride in Garcia Lorca's famous play, The Blood Wedding. It was a role that had consumed her, body and soul. The dark, tragic tale of love, betrayal, and fate resonated with her on a level she couldn't quite explain. She was drawn to the intensity of the emotions, the way the characters were swept along by forces beyond their control, their lives written by destiny. She had never forgotten the bloodstains on her dress, and the way the audience reacted as she stood on the stage. She was the center of everyone's attention. The imagery of the blood wedding, the moon, the forest, the knife, she loved all of it. Even after the curtain had fallen and the applause had faded, Juanita found herself haunted by the passion and the drama of the inevitable tragedy. As an adult, she'd lived her life with that same dramatic intensity, one tragic romance after another. For her, it was all a game. She was a skilled player. Though she'd had many relationships, she claimed to have never loved any of the men who fell for her. She liked to bait them, hook them, then watch them sink and move on to the next. That is, until she met Julian. He had a fire within him that matched her own, and she fell head over heels. When it came time to plan her wedding, she knew it couldn't be simple, ordinary affair. She wasn't interested in the typical white dress, the standard vows, or the traditional reception. No, her wedding would be an event, an experience that would leave her guests talking about it for years afterwards. A wedding no one else could match. In a way, Juanita saw her wedding as the ultimate performance. It wasn't just about marrying the man she loved, but about crafting a narrative, a story that would unfold in real time, with her at the center. She wanted her guests to be swept up in the emotion, to feel as though they were part of something larger than life, something unforgettable. At this point, she had no idea just how unforgettable the night would end up being. Now, Santiago, Mexico, is a charming and traditional Mexican village, not far from the big city of Monterrey and only an hour from Miguel's ranch. The perfect location for the pre-wedding ceremony. Juanita and Rosa plastered flyers welcoming everyone to the celebration to be held at twilight in the town plaza. Juanita had carefully planned the entire event to be a spectacular production. Her dress wouldn't be white, but a deep blood red, symbolizing both love and the tragic inevitability of death. The women in the wedding party would be dressed in red as well, and the men were instructed to wear black, adding dramatic contrast and emphasizing the theatrical atmosphere of the whole event. Orange marigolds and red roses were placed on every table throughout the plaza, and petals were strewn in the fountain and along the pathways. Papel picado, the colorful paper banners popular in Mexican folk art, were carefully hung from one end of the plaza all the way to the other and along the street where the procession would begin. On the day of the celebration, fighting had broken out between the Northeast and the Gulf cartels, and tourists were advised to adjust their flight plans. The Federal Aviation Administration had released a statement earlier in the day that several flights in and out of Monterrey were being rescheduled due to cartel activity. The travel advisory included information about recent violent crime, kidnapping gang activity, and targeted assassination attempts. Jack and Sasha's flight was delayed for hours. They barely had time to rent a car and make it to Santiago in time for the scheduled photo shoot. It was just a rush to get dressed and arrived at the plaza in time. Military and police forces were present everywhere as a result of the violent activity. Blood had been shed on the streets of Monterrey and some of the nearby villages. People were advised to stay in their homes and avoid the crowded plazas. In Juanita's mind, it only added to the dramatic flair of the celebration she had planned. Now, Miguel was much more concerned and advised her to forego the pre-ceremony party in the streets of Santiago. Now, Juanita was not about to let a little cartel feud get in the way of her special event. And besides, the majority of the cartel war was taking place in the city of Monterrey, not in the little village of Santiago. She was sure they'd all be safe. It was her special day, and she'd been planning this event for months. Everything was in place. The flowers, of course, the band, the tables of food and alcohol, and skull masks for the entire wedding party. The band was instructed to play a dark and mournful wedding march song as the progression started, and then livening up to a crescendo as they reached the plaza. Then, and only then, the real party would begin. Well, as twilight fell on the plaza, the small town of Santiago began to buzz with anticipation. The streets were lined with locals and visitors alike, drawn to what promised to be a sight they'd never forget. Even with the violence shaking the nearby city of Monterrey, they weren't about to miss the spectacle or the party. And in the center of it all were Juanita and Julian, leading the procession in their sugar skull masks through the narrow cobblestone streets. The air was thick with the scent of marigolds and roses and candle wax from the hundreds of lit candles that lined the route. The dark, haunting sound of the mariachi band echoed off the old stone building. Children darted alongside the procession, tossing petals into the air and laughing. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing could disturb the magic of this night. But then, like a speeding bullet, a pickup truck barreled through the barricaded streets and screeched to a halt before the crowd. 4 men jumped from the truck and, like a thunderclap out of the clear sky, began shooting. When the first shots rang out, everyone looked around expecting this to be part of the performance. Even Julian glanced at Juanita and wondered, did she plan this? The look of fear in Juanita's eyes told him otherwise. He quickly grabbed her, shielding her with his body as more bullets whizzed past his head, so close he could smell them. People began screaming and yelling, "Get down!" but their voices were drowned out by the sudden chaos that erupted around them. People were diving for cover behind anything they could find as more gunfire filled the square. Montoya had been watching the procession from the sidelines. hidden behind a large palm tree in the plaza so he wouldn't be noticed. But now, acting every bit the hero, he ran to Juanita to protect her. "It's the cartel!" he cried. But before he could say anything more, he staggered, clutching his side as blood blossomed on his white shirt. "Montoya!" Juanita screamed and dropped to her knees beside him. She grabbed him just before he collapsed, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the wound. Blood stained her fingers, hot and sticky, and for a moment, all she could hear was the deafening roar of her own heartbeat. Miguel and Usco grabbed the two young toddlers and whisked them into a nearby shop, ducking as more bullets whizzed past their heads. Jack led Sasha and Catherine in behind them, and the shopkeeper led everyone into a back room for safety. Jack told Miguel to stay with the women and the kids, and he ran back out to get Juanita and Julian. Just as quickly as they came, the truck peeled away, leaving one of the gunmen running behind the truck. Julian threw his mask to Juanita and sprinted after him while the pickup truck raced away. He ran through the streets, chasing the gunman through the twisting alleys. Meanwhile, back at the procession, Juanita had cradled Montoya in her arms. "Don't move," she whispered, and she placed the fabric from her dress against his wound. "You'll be okay." Montoya's breath was labored, but he managed a weak smile. "It's just a scratch," he muttered, though the pain in his voice was clear. The bullet was meant for Julian, not for me. "And how do you know that?" Juanita asked. But Montoya closed his eyes and wouldn't answer. "100 times I wished you were dead," Juanita said. 100 times. Julian was closing in on the gunman. The alleyways seemed to twist and turn endlessly, and his lungs were burning from the exertion. As he rounded the corner of a small dark alley, he almost ran into the back of the gunman, who was quickly retracing his steps, walking backwards. In front of him was a snarling wolf. With Julian at his back and the wolf at his front, the gunman had nowhere to go. The wolf lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground in a flurry of movement. The gunman struggled, but the wolf was on top of him with his lips pulled back, snarling at him with his sharp canine teeth exposed, ready to tear into his neck. Julian yelled, "Who sent you to disrupt my party?" The man only sneered, his face twisted in pain and defiance. "You know you won't make it out of here alive," Julian said. "Tell me who sent you." The man tried to push the wolf off, but Julian stepped on his arm, holding it down, while the wolf sunk his teeth into the man's neck. Not enough to kill him, just enough to scare him into talking. "Okay," the man whispered. The wolf released its grip just slightly, to give the gunman the chance to breathe. "It was Montoya," the man whispered. "He paid us to kill you. The bullet was meant for you. He wasn't supposed to get in the way." Julian looked at the wolf and gave a nod, and the wolf released his grip on the man's neck. Julian stepped away, removing his boot from where it held the man's arm and forcing him to stand. "I should kill you," he said, "and if you run, I will kill you." He led the man back to the plaza and handed him over to the police, who were now on the scene, taking pictures and statements from the crowd. By the time they had returned to the plaza, Montoya was sitting up, pale and shaken. Juanita's face lit up with relief as she saw Julian approach. "He's going to be fine," Juanita said. Montoya managed a weak smile, avoiding Julian's eyes. Julian looked at him and sneered. "I'll take it from here," he told Juanita. She nodded and she left to wash the blood off her hands. The paramedics had arrived and were treating several of the victims. Several bystanders had been grazed by bullets, but luckily none had fatal wounds. Julian turned to Montoya and whispered, "If you survive this, Montoya, I'm going to kill you." Jack stood next to Julian as they watched Montoya loaded into a stretcher and placed in the back of a waiting ambulance. "What are we going to do about him?" he asked. Julian shook his head. "He gave me his word, and I gave him $30,000 to pay off his debt. He's a dead man." Jack put his hand on Julian's shoulder and nodded. "You do what you have to do. If you need my assistance, I'm here for you. Thank you, Jack, Julian replied. Thank you for showing up back there in the alley. The plaza had settled and everybody was beginning to emerge from their hiding places, cautiously. The procession was over, the festivities shattered by violence, but the night was still young, and there were still tables full of food and alcohol. Everyone, Juanita called out, her voice strong and clear. The night is not over. Let's not allow those bastards to take this moment from us. She raised her glass to the crowd, and they cheered. The band, still shaken, hesitated for a moment before one of the musicians stepped forward, adjusting his instrument and striking up a lively dance tune. The notes filled the air, cutting through the lingering tension and drawing people back into the celebration. Adorned with their sugar skull masks once again, the bride and the groom danced in the middle of the square. Soon the plaza was filled with laughter and music as the party came back to life, even more vibrant and determined than before. The guests danced and sang and toasted the bridal couple. The party continued well into the morning, and once again, the night belonged to Juanita and Julian. The plane touched down in Fairbanks with 2 young passengers from Russia. It took a lot of persuasion to get Vitya to allow Igor to accompany Natya on this mission, but he finally acquiesced. Vitya knew there was a possibility that Natya would fail, that seeing her mother would bring up past memories and emotions that would render her incapable of completing her task. He thought he could use Igor as a distraction. If it came down to choosing one or the other, he was sure Natya would choose Igor over her mother. Igor was told his mission was to ensure that Natya carried out her mission. He was to report all of her actions without Natya's knowledge and to intervene if necessary. This was the first time Natya had ever been outside of Russia, the first time she'd flown on an airplane. This was also the first time she'd been trusted with an assignment this far away from her handler. Now, Vitya had trained Natya since she was a child. From the very first day that she was brought into the organization, he had honed her skills till they were on par with the best operatives. And at 16, she was more valuable than almost anyone in the organization. She was his prodigy. That didn't mean she couldn't fail. Despite her youth, Natya had a rare blend of instinct and discipline, and also understood the consequences of betrayal. Vitya knew that Natya's connection to Sasha was both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability, and that this would be the ultimate test of her loyalty to the organization. Sasha was no ordinary target. Vitya worried about what might happen if Natya's emotions clouded her judgment, or worse, if Sasha managed to sway her to the other side. The bond between mother and daughter was powerful, and he feared that in the heat of the moment, Natya might hesitate. And that's when Igor would need to intervene. Upon arrival in Fairbanks, they were to check in at the safe house, and from there they would be instructed on where to find Sasha. The organization had spies in almost every major city in the world. They were just Russians who were living normal lives, carrying out routine jobs and unassuming careers. They were the eyes and the ears of the motherland. Someone, somewhere, would know where to find Sasha. The safe house was a small cabin nestled on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by thick pine forests that offered natural cover. On the outside, the cabin looked ordinary and nondescript, but Natya knew better than to judge by appearances. Inside, it was outfitted with all the necessary equipment for their mission: surveillance tools, secure communication lines, and weapons. After checking in, Vitya informed them that Sasha had been spotted at the airport, and that she and Jack Moore, though traveling under different names, had flown to Mexico. They had, however, bought round-trip tickets, and they'd be returning in 2 weeks. Vitya had also discovered that Sasha and Jack were staying a good distance outside of Fairbanks, a very small town with the name of Circle. He even knew about the old man whose land they were staying on, a man who went by the name of Grizzly Adams. Natya and Igor decided they'd take a drive to Circle in the morning, take a look around, get their bearings. They'd have 2 weeks before Sasha was due back, and that'd give them plenty of time to plan their next move. It was near dawn before the party began to wind down. The cleanup crew that Juanita had hired had already begun sweeping up the trampled flowers and cleaning spilt wax off the tables. Most of the food and all the alcohol had been consumed. The band had gone home as well as most of the townsfolk. It had been a fun event, despite the violent interruption. Juanita noticed that Julian seemed distracted, yet she didn't question him. She, as well as the rest of the village, thought the violence had been the work of gangs, one cartel fighting another. It was such a common occurrence that no one questioned it. Montoya's name had not come up again the rest of the evening. And now the focus was on the actual wedding. Julian thought it was best not to say anything to Juanita about what had really happened. Only Jack, Miguel, and himself knew the truth. As far as he was concerned, it would stay that way. They drove home to Miguel's ranch where Rosa had breakfast fajitas and mimosas ready for the family. Rosa had organized the final decorating of the hacienda, and everything was ready for the afternoon wedding. So everyone retired to their rooms for some much-needed rest. After only a few hours of sleep, Act 2 of Juanita's grand performance was in full swing. Miguel's veranda and lush garden had been decorated with tall white callia lilies in big bunches, tied with colorful ribbons. White and red rose petals littered the pathway leading to the bridal arch. There were peacocks fanning their feathers and roaming gracefully across the lawn, while musicians strummed classical guitars. It was elegant and quiet compared to the celebration of the night before. The golden afternoon sun bathed everything in a warm glow. The iridescent feathers of the peacocks, they shimmered like jewels in the sunlight, and the few guests that were invited mingled with the family, playing with the twins and drinking champagne. And finally, it was time, and Juanita appeared dressed in a long white lace gown holding Miguel's arm. Julian, waiting at the altar, watched her with a look of pure adoration. The ceremony was intimate and heartfelt. Afterwards, as the stars began to blanket the sky and the candlelight flickered in glass lanterns, the laughter and the music turned more lively. They danced and they drank and ate Rosa's wonderful fresh tortillas and meats. Then came the fireworks, the final spectacular display of color against the backdrop of a warm August night sky. Juanita breathed a sigh of relief. All of it, from the eventful celebration in Santiago to the elegant wedding at the ranch, it was the production and the performance that she had always dreamed of. Natya and Igor parked a good distance from the little town of Circle. Hiding their car on a logging road back in the trees, they strapped on backpacks and hiked in the rest of the way. To the townspeople, they wanted to appear as just two young backpackers exploring various parts of Alaska. They planned on telling people they were college students on a break. If anyone recognized their accents as being Russian, it wouldn't appear strange for two young students to be backpacking through the wilderness. There were many Russians living in Alaska. They would tell anyone who asked them that they were visiting an uncle that lived in Fairbanks. Sitting at the one and only small bar in Circle, they ate a sandwich and watched the old man at the bar drinking his beer. It was amusing to see that old mule standing on the wooden porch looking into the window as the old man sat on the bar stool, absorbed in his beer. They watched as he threw some money down on the counter and got up from his stool, reaching for his carved walking stick. They noticed that he walked with a considerable limp and looked as old as the mountains themselves. They heard the bartender say, "See you tomorrow, Grizz." And that's when they knew they'd found their man. They picked up their backpacks, paid their bill, heading out the door a few minutes after Grizzly had left. Well, he was slow, and they didn't want to draw attention to themselves by following him. As they stood on the porch of the bar, strapping on their backpacks, they could see Grizzly slowly walking down the middle of an empty dirt street, heading out of town, the mule at his side, and 2 Australian shepherd dogs following closely behind. "What a funny little town this is," Natya said. "I can't imagine my mother living here. It's so small." Igor pulled a map out of his pack and opened it up, pretending to show Natya the route that they'd be following, just in case anyone was watching him. He made a gesture, pointing slightly to the right of the direction that Grizzly had walked, and the two headed off in that direction, slowly, making sure that if anyone was indeed watching them, they would think the 2 kids were heading off towards the river and adjacent campground. Once they were again surrounded by trees, they circled back towards the direction that Grizzly had taken. It didn't take long to find him, slow as he was walking. Molly wore a bell around her neck, which helped also. Grizzly thought it would keep the bears away. Natya and Igor stayed a good distance back so as not to alert the 2 dogs, and they just listened for Molly's bell to guide them. It was not a particularly long walk to Grizzly's place, but it seemed to take forever at this snail's pace that he was walking along. Occasionally, the 2 dogs would run ahead, circle back, always making sure to keep him in sight. They didn't intend on having any interaction with the man, at least not yet. They just wanted to see where he lived and start circling around his property, looking for the cabin that Sasha might be staying in. Several times they stopped, listening for the bell in the distance and just holding themselves back. Walking as slowly as they were, it was easy to avoid snapping branches or making any sounds. Eventually, the bell on the donkey stopped ringing, and the 2 backpackers slowly approached what they could make out as a cabin out in front of them. Still, they did not want to get too close in case it set the dogs off barking. They were content to just identify the general vicinity of the old man's cabin. They turned and they began walking back towards town in their rental car. They planned on coming out again the next day and bringing their drone. They'd be able to find any other buildings nearby that might be where Sasha and her friend were staying. They had plenty of time for exploring. "Let's go find that river," Natya said with a smile on her face. For the first time in her entire life, she felt free to do whatever she wanted.